Grab your pre-workout and turn up that volume. It is time for a new episode of the Powerlifter's Den with your host, Cam Smith. What's up, Powerlifter's Den family? Want to rep the podcast and look good while doing it? Check out my official merch store at plden.company.site. We've got tees, hoodies, beanies, hats, and more, and gear that'll keep you motivated in and out of the gym. Every purchase helps support me and the podcast and keeps the den growing strong. So whether you're hitting a heavy squat session or just lounging in style, we've got you covered. Head to plden.company.site and grab your merch today. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Powerlifter's Den. I'm your host, Cam Smith, and today I wanted to bring on Coach P, also known as Coach P, Ben Pauli. We're kind of friends through Mike Skiba, and we'll be seeing each other probably this weekend at the Pro-Am. But before that, we wanted to record this episode and chat it up. So, Ben, why don't you introduce yourself?
My name is Ben Pauli. Most people, I think all of us know each other by our Instagram handles, so probably Coach P on there. Been powerlifting for over a decade. Coach strongman, powerlifting and combat sports mostly. I got a few random other athletes and Gen Pop people sprinkled in there, and that's probably it.
Yeah, so to kind of get into your background, I know that you had a former attempt at a career to be a fighter, and it kind of led into your career as a powerlifter. So maybe tell us about how that started.
So I started. It was oh shoot, man! When you're a teenager, basically in my family, I had a guy, Uncle Nelson. He's got a barn. Actually, sorry, no, he had a hay barn that we used to train out of, but we did our boxing in his basement. That was kind of the teaching you how to be a man kind of a thing. So we'd go down there. He'd teach you how to hit the speed bag and then heavy bag, and then you get into a little bit of light sparring and stuff. And so started training with that, and then I was a hothead and got in a lot of fights, and the old man almost kicked me out of the house. So it was the first generation of the MMA scene in Michigan and around the world at that time. This was when UFC was blowing up. So we had this big group of what was basically the original pros from Michigan. And one of their affiliate guys with them started a gym in my hometown, actually. Probably because it was in the middle of nowhere, so they got cheap rent. And basically the old man was like, all right, if you want to, stay under this roof, you're going to have to go do this inside of a gym so you don't get arrested. And then started doing that, fell in love with it, got my ass kicked by people half my size for about 5 to 7 years. And then I landed at, when I ended up going to Central Michigan University, and then I got in with a group of guys there, and then we all started training and competing together for, it was about between 4 and 6 years, just depending on who was there and whatnot. And then there was a couple years at the end there where I was kind of just in the coach's capacity. And then that was how I ended up finding the transition into powerlifting. There was a local strongman community. So I was kind of, I was bouncing with a few of those guys, and they asked me to come train. I would do some of the strongman stuff. They were heavily into the West Side Conjugate stuff. Around that time, they had the Josh Thigpen 531 come out, which was, I don't even know. It might have been out already. I'm not sure, but right around that was what everybody was kind of digesting. And through that, I started rehabbing the back, found the Louis stuff, and then I went to a local powerlifting meet, and then I saw it, and I was like, this is badass. I want to mess with this. And I was training strongman at the time, too, just kind of trying to figure out what I wanted to do, and that's how that transition happened for me.
Yeah, so did you start off raw and kind of make your way into gear, or did you start right off in a gear?
Yeah, I was like hardcore, raw, elitist guy. I was actually, I didn't know anything about any of the feds, so I was trying to get into the the collegiate USAPL kind of side of things.
Yeah.
And then, but I had a career as a I built pole barns for a living for a handful of years before I ended up going back into college. And by the time I went, I tried to like get into the collegiate thing. I was like, do we have like a chapter we have to start or whatever? And I was too old because I was like 23.
Yeah.
So I was like out, I couldn't like do that. So I'm like, all right. And then I figured out federations and shit like that. And then they had a local APA meet. Um it was about 45 minutes south of the college. And then I was like, all right. So I ended up signing up for that. And then that ended up being my first meet.
Yeah, and obviously since then you've kind of blown up your total to over 2,700, and I think from there you've obviously kind of adapted the full life of powerlifting with coaching and things like that, as well as obviously expanding to other sports. I guess from just being a competitor to kind of being someone that produces content that make to help people with rehab or get stronger and just things like that. What kind of led you down that route rather than just kind of sticking to being an athlete?
So it was as I was coming up, like when I jumped into the Central Michigan wrestling room for the MMA thing, when I was there, everything was real chaotic, and I liked everything to be very buttoned up training wise. I like to, we warm up, we roll, or we warm up and we hit mitts, and then we spar and everything, and it was just chaos. And we had one older gentleman that was kind of trying to run the show, and then after being there for about 2 days, I figured out the dude didn't know what the fuck he was doing. He was like a fighter. He was like a fan. Um, that tried to take the driver's seat for the coaching. And then I was like, all right, we're not going to do this. So then me and my buddy that was training there, we took over and we kind of dual head coached. I took more of the stand up stuff. He did more of the groundwork. And then I was kind of overall game plan stuff. And then um, as I was in that space, I started to figure out that I had a good knack for breaking stuff down. That's kind of where I would say my specialty is, kind of bridging that gap with they have real science based training stuff, and that would be beneficial to a fighter or a meathead or a lifter of any kind, whatever. And I figured out that I could take these training concepts that people didn't understand and kind of break it down for them. And we could take like high level boxing footwork or Muay Thai techniques, and I could break it down so people could understand it. And that's kind of how I started to figure out that I was good in that coaching space. And it was more of just like that translation of a piece of knowledge down to whatever level that they were on.
Yeah, and I think one of the bigger problems with some of these coaches, especially in powerlifting, is the recycling of information without being able to explain why they're doing it. And I think that being able to break that down is what obviously having a good relationship with your athlete and things like that make a good coach. But I think being able to break down things is something that's often overlooked rather than, oh, this coach has these athletes who have this total, so he must be good.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. That was I asked, like, one of my buddies had gotten into powerlifting a couple years before me, and he came off the couch and just ripped a 600-pound deadlift. And then like 2 years later, he pulled 700, and then he never in like 5 years after that made it past 700. And he was just basically that strong. It was like first time on a barbell 600, and then a little training was 700, and that was basically how much he could round his back and finish a deadlift. And he didn't know how to break anything down. And I was asking him for help. And then I realized that he never had to even think about the journey that I was at, where at the time, from a bunch of multitude of factors, I had ruined my back a bunch of times doing manual labor stuff. And I blew my back out like 275, like in a weight room around at Central Michigan. And I had sciatica down my left leg so bad. I was like atrophied down my one left side, all this crazy stuff. And I was kind of like, all right, well, I need somebody to help me fix this, and like that understands the form and everything. And then I started just to hyper educate myself. I was always really good in the sciences. And then that was kind of what helped me figure out my career path as well. As I was like, oh, meathead stuff plus science. That's right where my wheelhouse is.
Yeah, and for me, like I had a similar issue when I was like 18, I think, because I didn't start training till I was like 16 or 17 just for sports. And then I think I remember it so specifically. It was like a rack pull with like 365. And I remember I threw out my back, and then I had like sciatica issues for like 2 years. And that's why with like the breaking down of things and being able to understand a lot more is something that I'm super interested in, because I had to go through that shit myself and figure it out when the even 5-10 years or well fuck, I'm old now, 7 years ago,
Yeah.
there was not as nearly much information on that sort of rehab from a powerlifting aspect. It was more of like an occupational therapy aspect.
Yeah. When I started, this was like, I started dabbling in the powerlifting training specifically around like 2010, kind of doing more heavy compound movements. And there was nothing in there like they hadn't had any, there was no soft tissue, there was no nothing. What I started to get on is we went over PNF stretching, which is kind of like contract and relax, or like the brainchild of what is now the pails and rails stuff for mobility and the FRC stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I started to use some of that I picked up out of college. And I was like, okay, well, I could figure out. And then outside of that, it was just really long duration static stretching. There was a time when I did well on my mobility, but it's just not practical, where I would go to like the hot tub at the student athletic center and I would do static stretching for like an hour. And that was good, but it was almost kind of like, all right, I could have got that in like a yoga sense or whatever, but it helped at the time because I was so tight. But for a lot of guys, that'd probably get their joints super lax and they'd probably run into a lot of injuries then. But
Yeah, so that was actually going to be my follow-up question is like someone like me, like obviously I'm still young, but at the same time I have like very hypermobile joints. Like my hip mobility is kind of ridiculous, and like I could basically dislocate my shoulders if I want. Like, so when it comes to like mobility work, I mean I do dynamic stretching and warm-ups and things like that to like stay safe, but I don't necessarily do like a lot of mobility work. So I kind of wanted to know from your perspective, like where's that fine line when to try to figure out like what you need to do.
so the way that I kind of explain it for a lot of people is we have X range of motion for a muscle group or a movement that we need to execute optimally. And a lot of guys that are immobile are riding that line right here, right by their usable range of motion. For instance, like in a bench press, we see a lot of guys will get down and they don't have this little bottom part of the range of motion, so they dump, touch it like this, and then they rotate or cuff it out of the bottom, and they ride that very fine line with where their usable mobility is. And what I try to explain to them is, I'm like, you're going to produce the best amount of force with the lowest risk for injury when you're kind of in that center performance zone. From what we've seen on our end of things, is like there's like that. If it was this big, just to quantify it, it'd be somewhere right in here, or maybe towards that top, maybe 50 to 80% of that optimal usable range, where we're not going to get into an injury. And so, for instance, you see a lot of guys, they pop their hamstring deadlifting. The hamstrings are probably the biggest one I see for immobile muscle groups that are limiting a lift.
Yeah.
So like, so I tell everybody, I'm like, if we can figure out a good strategy to get you mobile, we don't need to open it up like crazy. I want you to be mobile enough to execute your technique optimally. And that's it. We don't, as a power lifter, we don't need you to be hyper mobile like that. And then for, a guy in your scenario, we would start looking at, all right, where's the access ranges of motion? Is it in such an access that it's causing a stability issue? I would say off the top of my head, probably, yeah. Somewhere in there. So then we would start working on stability and strengthening at those end ranges of motion, and then kind of shake the tree and see what comes out with that, trial and error with that stuff. And that's another whole spiel we could go on, is, having a coach and an athlete relationship where they trust you enough to allow you to experiment. Where I think a lot of people are like, oh, this guy just has the magical program that's going to give me a 2K total or whatever it is,
Yeah, well, so that's what something too with the kind of coaching relationship athlete and working with Skiba. Obviously, like you know how our relationships go with Skiba. It's just it's hilarious. But he also gives us kind of the freedom. Like he knows a lot of us know what we're doing. Obviously, like you and Rupo and like all these people that are squatting these fucking insane weights and shit. Like they'd have to know what they're doing at least somewhat to get to that point. Obviously, him helping, but when you have some of those freedoms to make adjustments, especially like auto regulation things, like that time a few weeks ago, I wanted to deadlift a day early. It's like a small example like that. Something like that is what's going to make that athlete get to that next level.
Yeah, and that's all your auto regulating and picking up on. Like for us, we have our awesome group chat that is supposed to be about lifting that never is, but
It's not a lifting group chat.
yeah, exactly. So we get, you can bounce stuff off like that. That was one good thing that I started out with doing is I was like, I'll just be a pest and ask these really strong guys like what to do until they just tell me to fuck off. And then I got some really good info out of that. But I think, like like what I loved about jumping in with Skiba was that like it was super conjugate, bands, chains, box squats, all that shit. I love that. If we could hang bands and chains from anything, I'd like it 10 times more. So that was good. The numbers were speaking for itself. What he did with Rupo in a year was what 200 pounds on the squat or something wild, right?
Yeah.
So like I was like, all right, I love that. And then for me, I like being part of a team and having a coach. Not just I don't not that I need it. I coach myself, for basically the majority until this point. I just like being a part of the team and I like having somebody tell me what to do. So then I can kind of get out of that mindset of coach and I'm doing what's on the paper. And at the time when I joined with him, I was doing too much optimal shit and I was doing like, oh, this feels, a certain way. I'm going to shut it down. And now I'm like, no, we have a 3 week wave. Everybody's going to post their squat on whatever day. And I have to try to have the best number out of the whole group. And that's what I'm going to do. And I don't care what I have to do to get there. And then proof's in the pudding. I'm already shooting way up. I should be on track for a nice big squat PR at the next one.
Yeah, and I think that's what's cool about conjugate is obviously accessory work and secondaries and other things like that, and slight tweaks and variations are coach based. And like I probably don't have the same accessories as someone else in the group, but when we have those same like max effort days and we're all maybe in right outside of meet prep running those like same weak ways, whether it's like the giant camber bar gauntlet or those fucking crazy band deadlifts, like it's something that gives another aspect of competition that you don't get in just training by yourself.
Yeah, that's a huge part. It's like, and with how close everybody can be in communication online, it's almost like having a separate crew of your own. Like I have my crew at the gym, and then I have you guys, and that's an awesome aspect. I wouldn't have pushed the majority of the squats that I've pushed lately if I didn't have Big German there and Rupo and Bobby pushing on my heels and stuff like that. But I think part of what I like about Mike's coaching style is he puts it on you, and this is what I've done with my athletes over the years, and it's you can't hold their hand, and if you do, you teach them to kind of be on the back seat or in the back seat with their training, and they're not accountable for continuing their own education. So even for the young guys, like for me, I kind of looked at it as like a graduate. I'm like, all right, I knew I wanted to go with Mike a long time ago, and I was like, I'm gonna wait until I'm close to doing something wild, and then I'm gonna bring in the big guns, and we're gonna paint this masterpiece. But like we get our young guys like Logan and stuff, where he's gonna come up under that system. If Mike is coaching him the way that he does, it's awesome because it forces Logan to go into the books and educate himself and figure stuff out and learn how to train. And then he also, obviously can ask Mike anything or ask any of us anything, but it gives him a bigger sense for continuing his own education. And that's a horrible thing for most of these lifters. They don't want to learn shit. A lot of guys, some guys I like. I got my one guy. I posted him in the group that was like third time in the shirt. He did 1,005 double to a one board and a fucking band shirt.
Fucking stupid.
And then he squatted this prep. Like this is why equipped is so fucking hard. I try to explain to these guys how much harder it is than raw lifting. But like this guy had peaked and he hit a 1205 squat with a reverse micro like it was nothing.
What the fuck?
And I'm like, I in my system, I've had guys hit their reverse monster 2 weeks out and hit that on the platform. So I'm like, this motherfucker's going to squat 1,200 his first meet. Fuck this guy. But then he got there and it was hard. The adrenaline got to him, all kinds of stuff. So we ended up with an 1,100 pound squat, still an asshole for the first meet, which is madness. But also he was top 30 super heavyweight totals of all time already going in. So it's like a Dan Bell jumping in, you know what I mean? Well, not exactly like a Dan Bell, but up there, right? And like for him, I like he'll ask me limited questions, but he just wants to come in and be a fucking nut and an animal, and I like that. But he's willing to learn if I told him, and he had a lot of time in the weight room. So there's a time and a place, but I think he's one of those guys. He's got the genetics on his side,
yeah,
and he's explosive as all hell. Most of us are going to have shit like you, like how you got your loose joints, my back's off. Like I have so many surgeries and injuries. I don't even the guy that does my hernia surgeries just knows me by name now. Like I've had so many. I've had both sides, stomach. I got a hiatal and diastasis coming into all kinds of crazy shit. So like stuff like that, where it's not that you need to do this stuff. Like sometimes I think a lot of kids think about it like that's gonna be my way to close the gap on the genetics that the other guy has. And I try to tell them like, no, motherfucker, this is gonna be what keeps you alive for 10 years or whatever of doing this.
Yeah, and another thing with the group chat, just being in that like environment too, outside of just what we have, is the fact that like we get to travel to these local gyms around here. Like I'm gonna get to see you this weekend, and in Bain, and me and Donnie, like we're gonna get to train and shit like that. Like when you don't communicate with other people like that, you miss out on a lot of shit. Not only just friendships and shit like that, but you could learn one thing, whether it's setting your shirt just a little bit differently or just a little tweak to your stance and your squat that can be a fucking game changer.
Oh yeah, and then you get all these guys like that have trained with somebody that has hypermobile shoulders or has deadlift leverages that's trying to build a bench. It's like, some of these guys, if they have a crew of all monster benchers, then they're not going to have very good information on how to build a deadlift.
Yeah.
Stuff like that and then that's what's great about our group is we have that big mixed bag of everybody, and that's like that's trucked that powerlifting journey from all different walks and everything like that, and then all the totals are all scattered across. So chances are there's going to be somebody that has a viable answer for you if you're stuck on your training.
Yeah, well, if you know someone that has been able to give someone a good bench with deadlift leverages, let me know because I'm still fucking looking.
Hey, it just takes a long time and a fucking monster load of upper back and tricep work, but you'll get there, man. You'll be all right.
Yeah, so for you, I know you're looking to compete this fall, I believe. Are you planning on doing Holy Wars?
I'm planning on doing Holy Wars. Our issue is my wife's in sales. She sells like fancy jewelry to people, and they have what's called blackout. It's between basically it's like November through it's like after Halloween until the new year.
Yeah.
And it's blackout because they can't miss any days of work, and they basically work like 7 days a week kind of a thing. And then so traveling is very limited. I like to bring my wife to all my meets with me. So we're still trying to do that and see if we can do a quick turnaround and just fly in and fly out maybe the night of the meet, something like that. I would like to do that. I'm going to do one with Skiba there with me before I'm done. But if I can't get to that this year, then it's going to be we have one in October that's real huge at our gym, and I like competing at home because I can get my parents to come. My parents are getting old, so it's increasingly more important for them to kind of see this stuff. And then I got my kids; they can watch too, and I like setting that example and all that. So sometime in the fall will be it. I talked to Mike about this a handful of times. I'm stuck in between a rock and a hard place right now because I'm building everything so well, and without having that meat hanging above my head, it's not like, oh, I'm on the way to fixing this bum shoulder, but now we have to get into Circumax or whatever the fuck we're doing.
Yeah.
And then it just ends up, I'm like, okay, I rehabbed it 75%, and then I bring it back down to 60 across the peak. So I'm at this point, but then I'm kind of looking at it like, all right, the squats are rolling, squats are flying, and this stuff with these weights that we're getting into, it happens in a short window. So I'm trying to hit, hit it when it's hot instead of overdo it, trying to build too high without taking that PR, right? It's like, because I could sit there and build infinitely and try to push for a 1300 or some crazy thing. But it's like, all right, what do? I sit there for 3 years and don't do any meets? And then you might get some ring rust. I don't know.
Yeah, and for me, something that I've kind of been a fan of and kind of think that going forward I want to do is not necessarily plan so far ahead. Like pick a meet like 6 to 8 weeks out, or like do a shorter prep where, I mean, the style we train in with the max effort as well as keeping volume high year round, you almost stay in a state where you don't necessarily have to run like a 12-week prep. You can literally just go into a peak, and then you're taking so much pressure off yourself because you're not training for fucking 6 months for one meet.
I love that aspect of it. I mean, and this is classic conjugate method. I mean, I know a lot of guys, they get it messed up because they read the book of methods and they read the exact West Side way of the conjugate method. When you understand the conjugate method in its entirety, that's exactly what we're running. And you're continuously building all facets of your strength game. And then for us, we have a full kit squat once every like 5 weeks, I think it is, or something like that. And I mean, that's basically the only thing that you really need to have peaked up there, and then get a touch in the shirt, and then go, and then all of our it's heavily squat and bench focused, and then we're building the deadlift, but the deadlift's kind of on the back burner in terms of the overall program a little bit, but also that's what a lot of people don't understand about the equip lifting is a lot of times, like for me, I use the deadlift suit at the end of the meet. I'm actually stronger raw. That's one thing I'm working on is figuring out how to use the deadlift suit to my advantage. But I use it right now to get me back to my raw numbers because of the fatigue from the squat and the bench.
Yeah, that's actually, I never thought about it like that, because we were actually kind of talking about that today because we were up at Iron Helix and we were talking about like um what you can get out of your gear, and a conversation a few weeks ago came up of like, rather than you adapting to your, or yeah, rather than making the gear adapt to you, you have to adapt to your gear. And that comes down to, like, for me, like the deadlift, obviously my deadlift's been improving greatly, and that comes from obviously peaking it and building it and just training it, but learning some nuances into the suit and getting the straps tighter. And same with squat, like I didn't crank the straps before, but now I'm starting to crank the straps. Obviously I've gotten stronger, but I'm looking close to a 200-pound PR on squats in like 6 months.
Yeah, that's a whole different tier of stuff that we never messed with. I had a conversation with AJ Roberts and I was asking him like, what do I got to do to build to this 1200? And he's like, oh man, he's like, just get that raw squat up there. He's like, I got my raw squat to 800 and then I squatted 1200. I'm like, you get 400 pounds out of your gear, and fuck, 3 meet preps ago before I got into the meat and bones and the peak of the prep. This is before Mike. I squatted 880 in a pair of fucking knee reps raw. And I'm like, okay, well, so I should have a 1200 now. So that's what we realized. I'm like, what the fuck? And then you hear these, like, I mean, we've seen these crazy guys in shirts. Guy can barely bench 3 plates and they benches 750 in a shirt.
Yeah.
It's just maddening. So that's when you realize, like, all right, and that's where we're messing with that right now. I'm starting to tighten the straps up on the lighter ones just to get used to it kicking me around a little bit so I can use it. That's where I fucked up my last 1200 was I smoked my last warm up at 10:55 and everything was perfect. I should have just left the shit alone and then just understood that I was strong enough to squat the weight. But I was like, oh, I need more gear. So we tightened the hips on the suit. I tightened the quads, and then we cranked the strap. And then I went to sit back, and I got hit by a brick wall, and then got into my knees, and then cut it high, and then barely finished my squat. And it just didn't need to be that heavy, and it really pissed me off. But that's exactly what training's for. I'm trying to work out those kinks and figure it out. If you got to mark your straps for attempts, I'm going to start messing with that and stuff. But I mean, that's once you can figure that stuff out, that's just instant poundage, and just all you got to do is learn it.
Yeah, and that's what makes multiply fun, is all the extra variables that that can fuck your day up if you don't pay attention to them, as well as make your day so much better if you can learn to control them to how you want them. If you can obviously, like you said with the straps, for example, like kind of marking it, but maybe next time you try to go tighter and see what happens. And if you can, you're actually going to get more out of it if you can do it right. So there's like so many different areas to where you can basically add your total by just fucking around with what you wear.
Yep, I love that. I think that's where like you get these guys that are science minded, engineering type brains, where they really fall in love with that multiply aspect, and that's my favorite part of it. I mean, we have a guy that we're working closely with now that's done some alterations for some guys on the team, and he comes and sits down in my office, and he's not even a fucking power lifter, but he's a huge nerd with um like the technology of the fabrics and seams and stuff, and he got into it and he started killing it. He does amazing work, and I keep pushing him. I'm like, bro, let's go in. I'll buy some fucking sewing machines. Let's make a whole ass company. And now F8 stopped doing other types of gear alterations outside of their own, so it'd be perfect. So I actually have a meeting with him next week, and we're trying to set aside some time to see if we really want to make a business plan, because every time he does alterations for anybody, they absolutely love it. He's got some very good skill, and there's just a big hole there. But what's cool about that is like we can mess around. Like we bought in full spools of material and we made our own briefs and fucked around with all that stuff. And it's a very fun time. I like doing that shit.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what makes me interested as an engineer myself. Obviously, like learning all these little tips and tricks. Like at the end of the day, yeah, it's cool. You want to get strong, have a base. Obviously, raw training is important. Some people hate it. I'm kind of starting to hate it, but who knows where that will be in 2 years. But the point being is when you can add that extra layer, quite literally, it makes it way more fun, and it allows like the communication amongst the group. Like you can learn so much more, and you learn more about people, and you can learn the gear just as well as someone that doesn't know what's happening, or they could have designed it. Like you don't there's just such a wide range of who's in the gear, but there's so much knowledge to be learned from everyone inside that.
Yeah, it's fucking nuts with on the strongman side. Strongmen in general and my guys. These motherfuckers get 100 pounds out of their suit. Conventional pulling in a single ply suit.
Yeah.
And they crank the straps. We're like, most powerlifters are used to their gear. And then you have I have my strongman guys, they just jump in their suit every like 6 weeks and just dust a PR and they crank the straps. They got 10 foot of strap laying out each way. And they just strap it and go, man. So it's nuts. I'm trying to figure out what the hell's going on. I still can't wrap my brain around. And it might just be you just have to crank the shit and just figure it out, you know?
Yeah, and for like that's something that Connor does. Like he gets 100 pounds. I mean, it's sumo, but he still gets 100 pounds out of his suit, and that's why it's like when I like to go there to deadlift because I can always learn something from him, and I've learned so much from my deadlift from him. Him and Chris Delafive are the two that I've like watched their deadlift probably 100 times over to just learn exactly what they're doing. Like for me, one of the biggest things I took from Connor was the patience off the floor and just slowing down that lockout, not like slowing it down in speed, but slowing it down like in real time to figure out like keeping your weight on your quads. And that for me, that one thing alone has changed my deadlift.
Well, yeah, you get, and what's crazy about the deadlift, there's so many different styles of like what people would say on how to train it. A lot of guys are, they're like trained in a decent pair of briefs and then just lay the strap on and add the suit. Some guys like don't go with any briefs. Get a single ply that form fits to your body, and then you can move more and then do that. Some guys are huge on building the raw base up and then adding to that with the suit. Some guys have to train in the suit all the time to be able to groove the fucker the way they're supposed to. Kind of how a couple of cues led to a big breakthrough in your deadlift. Now I was just kind of saying how there's so many different strategies to it, and you're in a great spot because you have that nice, real high hip pull. So theoretically, you could add a bunch of stuff to the mix because you pull, you just bend and grab it, and you keep the hips high. That's a really good way. You get a guy like Delafave. He has that good, nice high hip pull. That's why he pulls so well. And he found that setup that works really, really well for him to pull big deadlifts. My issue was, I had a certain raw stance, and then I have way better leverage out wide, but then I had to develop my sumo in close because my hips were shit for a long time. And now I got better hip mobility, but it's so hard to break the technique because I had gotten to 800 raw before I jumped in the gear. And then I still go back to sometimes I think you just got to just put the suit on and go. It was my second time in the suit. I just cranked the fuck out of everything in an LUP. And then I dusted an 825 with probably 45 pounds in the tank, it looked like. And then I went backwards from there back to like 785 and then clawed my way back to 810. And then a random day in the gym, I took 845 for a double. And then I pulled 900 plus raw from 3/4 inch mat. So I'm just like, I don't know what the fuck to do. So I'm just going to get stronger and hopefully it goes up.
Yeah, and for me, I think one of the things that obviously was a big play too was when I first started, I pulled conventional my first 4 years. So when I started pulling sumo, it was right into gear. So I was learning to wedge against the briefs and the suit, and I was going loose strap. So I was learning that. So when I went to raw, I would go to wedge in, and I'd realize that there's nothing fighting me. I'm just going to keep wedging down until my fucking taint hits the floor. So then I was able to kind of learn more about the actual pull itself, like I said, with keeping the weight on the quad. So now when I'm back in the gear, I'm learning to leverage myself against the gear in a different way than I was before.
Yeah, you can almost learn how to pull yourself down into it to load it to help the bottom half.
Yeah.
But that was one of the topics I put on that questionnaire, and I go over this with guys all the time. Is like their strategy behind gear deadlifting is completely fucked. These guys will wear a setup that gets them 3/4 of the way through the lift. So they'll load up briefs and a tight strap, and they're like, I keep blasting weights off the ground to like my dick, and then I can't lock them out, and it just drives me nuts. I'm like, okay, but imagine if you were trying to get in a shirt or you're changing your bench technique, and you're like, I really like this bench technique, but I can only get to here. I can't lock the fucking thing out. That's exactly what they do, and then that goes back to the hamstring mobility thing, and then also a lot of their stuff, I basically just tell them we have to engineer up a setup, a technique, and whatever setup you want in your gear to get the lockout. Whatever gives you the best lockout, that's what we want. And then we need to develop off the floor. These guys will just go with whatever suit and blast weight off the floor because they think it's a speed contest, and that's a huge issue altogether that we can go into. But yeah, that's a huge thing that I see that drives me bonkers. I'm like, why are you analyzing 3/4 of a lift? The lockout's the most important part.
Yeah, and that's kind of not only in the deadlift, but with all the lifts, because obviously the bottom portion is something that is mostly, or not mostly, it is being helped the most in the gear. But when you're raw, it's some people it's basically the opposite. Like for me, I'm fast off the floor, I'm fast off the chest and out of the hole. But for some raw lifters, it's the complete opposite. So when you go into the gear and you're only training that part that's helping you, you're not getting what you need out of it.
No, that's I see that all the time. And then a huge thing is how like people are trying to analyze lifts incorrectly all across the board. They miss a lift because of position, and then the first thing they ask is like, what's the weak muscle group? Like for instance, in a deadlift, if you're rounding your back, right? So we're creating a spinal flexion and a posterior pelvic tilt. We're creating slack into the glute. So you could have the strongest glutes in the world, but you can't produce force in a muscle that has slack in it. It'd be like trying to do a max bicep curl with your arm like this, and you have no leverage for one, but the contractibility just isn't there. That's not how the muscle works. And so we see these guys, they miss, like, man, I got to get my glutes stronger. And then they hammer their glutes and then they wait a year and they get their hip thrust strong or all this, whatever, good morning or whatever. And then they get a 5-pound PR in their deadlift. And that was probably just because they got their back stronger. But what I encourage them to do is I'm like, all right, guys, if you're missing a lift and it looks like shit, then we need to analyze the technical component. If you're in perfect position and then we miss a lift, then we can start analyzing muscle groups, because then we can start to look at what's the weakest link in the chain of muscle groups. If we're trying to analyze a weak muscle group with shit technique, you have no idea where to start, because you have horrible leverage when you get to the longest part of the lever, which would be like deadlifting in front of the kneecaps or just above the knee, and your back's rounded, your brace is compromised, and then we start over training and doing repetitive reps on muscle groups that are not supposed to be working. So then you ingrain that horrible technique over a long period of time, and it's just a nightmare to fix.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what's like, that's why I think with the difference between the raw lifting and the gear lifting is everyone just assumes that it's a strength issue, a muscle group issue. But when I think more people in the gear are more minded to, I mean, some people are just like, oh, it's the fucking shirt. I need a new shirt, all that stupid shit. But I
Oh
think,
my God, the changing of the fucking shirts every 3 days with these people.
I know it's absurd, but it's the, all right, well, did I sit back? Did I open my knees? Did I flare? Like there's so much more than like, oh, is my triceps weak? It's you're breaking down the movement first.
Well, and like these guys are nuts, dude. Like they're like, are my triceps weak? I'm like, are you doing all of your accessories? And they're like, yeah. I'm like, so you have 2 whole days worth of tricep work every week, and your triceps are fucking huge, and you're asking if your triceps are weak because you can't lock out a bar. It's like, okay, well, there's a technical issue here. It's not if you're just actively doing this shit. That's what, in general, people with training, they're so nuts. They miss a lift and they're like, oh, I got weaker or something. It's like, dude, you've been training every fucking day for a decade. You're not getting weaker. You're just not technically proficient, or we need to change something, or you just misgrouped that one rep and we need to fix it.
Yeah, and that's what's been fun for me with the gear. Like it's, during the circuit maxes and just a couple of the week waves before, like I missed a weight so light. Like I think I missed what did I miss? I missed like something stupid on the first week, and then I think I missed like 600, and then I hit 700 with the all that shit, and it was like, all right, I missed a lift now. I'm like, okay, I can do this. I did it wrong. I'm taking it again, rather than, oh, I'm just not strong enough today.
That's what I told my lifters this all the time. I'm like, when you miss a lift, the first thing you need to do is ask yourself, what did I fuck up? Because your strength doesn't magically dissipate, especially for those of us that have been in the game a long time. The skill of strength starts to trump all of that. How many of the you look at Skiba, he's highly skilled in the gear, so he just kind of pops in whatever he wants, and he's like, I'm gonna go total 2,500, and then he just goes into the fucking sunset and then comes back, right? Like that's the skill aspect. So like once you learn the skill of moving heavy weights, then we can start to develop different strategies on how to coach yourself. But I tell guys, like, when they're doing reps, I'm like, give yourself rep to rep feedback. If we're doing an RPE 8 or like an 80, 85%, 75, 80, 85%, whatever that is, and you know the tempo of the lift and the bar speed you're supposed to have, and then you don't get it, then you need to look at what did I do, and then have yourself correct that the next one. You're like, all right, my knees caved a little bit, I lost my upper back. All right, fix that on the next rep, and then that's real time learning, and that's how you get the best over time.
Yeah. And then I guess we'll kind of regress back a little bit about some of the times you've competed. Obviously, you've been competing for a long time and you've learned plenty of things along the way. But as far as some of the people you've met or some of the influences that have helped you the most, like what, or maybe even just a funny story, like what are some of your favorite moments from your career?
Oh God, there's so much shit. Um, I would say okay, so I I did my first, like, what I would call like a big meet, not a very large meet, but it was big name lifters. There was Delafave and there was Merck there, and they were calling squats in a window about yay big, so it was all over the place,
Yeah.
which is fine, whatever. Hopefully, I get the high one, right? But um, we were sitting there and we had a super tight battle going into the third squat, and one of the guys that was up there with us, he cut it super fucking high. And I was sitting there acting like a little bitch about it. And I just looked, I'm like, what the fuck was that? Blah, blah, blah. Bitching up a storm. And I look over at Delafave and he's like, it don't matter. And I'm like, he's like, it don't matter. It don't matter. And then he just walks in the back. And then he started pacing around doing his thing. And that was a really great lesson that I learned is like, it doesn't really fucking matter about what's going on with the judges or any other lifter. And this is kind of a thing that I developed on my own with like my competitive strategies with powerlifting is it's like in a group, I'll go toe to toe with a guy and maybe squeak out an extra squat that I wouldn't have gotten. But like when it comes to meets, your meets decided 3-4 weeks out with
Yeah.
how good your training cycle was. So I'm not going to sit there. I tell this like story to my guys. I'm like, if you're going to bench against Jimmy Kolb, you're not going to put a fucking a heavy metal PR song in your earbuds and then go out there and beat him in the bench. It's like you just need to execute and do the best that you can do, and then put that into everyday training, and that's how you're going to have the best result. It's okay to be directly competitive with guys like that, but some of these guys that get into these powerlifting meets and they start being assholes to people and they're like starting fights in the warm up room and doing all this shit. It's not needed. I've tried it and it didn't work well for me at all. But it just is always going to come down to you executing and then figuring out what the fuck you did wrong and why that happened at your meet. And that was a that was a great learning experience. That was right there at the meet. And I'm like, all right, that's something that was from a veteran, and that was like, oh, that was Merck's meet where he totaled 29:05 in the unlimited, and so it was great. I got to watch how they execute stuff like they were in the back warm up room, and I'm getting nuts, fucking headbutting bars, freaking out, and all this dumb shit that I used to do. I still get angry and punch stuff and stuff, but that's just how I like to lift and let some anger out. But like at that time, they were just kind of nonchalant, fucking around, just sitting down, walking around, having fun with everybody. And I was like, oh, it's not. You don't need when you learn how to squat heavy weights or when you learn how to execute technically proficient. You don't need all of this extra adrenaline. Your adrenaline's going to peak as soon as you step onto that platform, either way. And if you're already way too jacked up, then you're going to lose your shit adrenaline wise. and then you're not going to execute your technique, and then you're just going to adrenaline dump for the rest of the meet, and everything's going to go to shit.
Yeah, and that's kind of what you said with your meets kind of decided 3 to 4 weeks out, and something that my football coach used to say all the time. I even have it on the back of a fucking t-shirt. Is the hay is in the barn? Like, dude, we practice is over. Like, we've already put in the work for this week. Like, whatever happens on game day, we prepared for it. Same with the meet. Like, you go in, you have your attempts picked for a reason. Yeah, you can make adjustments if warm-ups are going like shit, or vice versa, or you want to make a bigger jump, but everyone knows what they're going to total in their mind. Like, if you go, what am I going to do if I go 7 for 9? What if I only get my openers? Like, there's so much preparedness already done that you don't need to be all serious. Like, have fun with the people at the meet.
Well, and it's just nuts because we're all doing this to have fun, and most of us in this sport, especially in the equipped, are everybody's fucking cool, man. Everybody's super nice, and everybody like I would
Most.
like we're gonna go get some fucking beers. I like to go get some beers with most of the people I meet. There's a select handful of people that are assholes to everybody, and that just is what it is. But like most of these guys, like I talk to Merck all the time. I ask him a bunch of questions. I asked LFA a bunch of questions. Just reach out to Cole, everybody's super cool. They'll help you out, and it's a really great community. And it just never, if you start competing that way, and you start to analyze stuff in a realistic manner and take what you've trained for, and then you start planning stuff smart. I remember it was our last meet, it was my first meet with Mike. I had one of my guys who was a buddy of mine from our gym, and he's like real good with numbers and stats and shit. And he started crunching different total outcomes. And he's like, I was going to open at 1,003 and go to 11. And he's like, well, what's the percentage chance that you get that? I'm like, that's an RPE. That's like a RPE 9.5, 10. So I would say it's probably a 70% chance I get it, 30% miss, maybe even greater than that. And so he started giving me all these calculations, and we found out that I had basically like an 11 times greater chance of totaling a 27 if I stopped at a 1085. And so, sure as shit, I used my old squat suit that Skiba told me if I ever put it on again, he's going to kill me. But bloated up, quads went numb, stopped at 1085, barely got that. And then I tried to get the blood out of my legs, and we pulled the suit down, pulled it back up, all this bullshit. And then I missed an 1135, I think is what I ended up taking. But because I made that stop at 1085, I hit my benches I needed to. I ended up getting my 2,700 total on my second pull, and my deadlifts were in the fucking dumpster. I have no idea how I did this. I ended up coming back and hitting a deadlift PR, or no, sorry, I matched a deadlift PR, or wait, no, 5-pound deadlift PR on my third attempt. And then I ended up adding whatever, I got like 35 pounds out of that extra little jump. And part of that was, conditioning. I had some more juice at the end of the meet, stuff like that. But the main reason I had success in that meet is because I was realistic with my attempts, and I didn't have that ego of I need to be here and jump to 1,100-pound jump, all this stuff where it's like, all right, it's okay to stop in the mid thousands here. And you're going to understand this when you get to like these weights that are like the 8s, the 9, the 1,000, those landmark weights. You'll get close. You're like, I just want to fucking jump it. And then you'll tell yourself, I used to tell myself something dumb. I'd be like, all right, man, if I just jump there on my second attempt, I'll have 2 shots to get it, or 1 shot to fuck it up and get in your head, and then you're going to miss the third anyway. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's funny because I'm so naive still, because I was literally thinking for my meet in April, I'm like, why don't we just like open at 930, then go to 1,000, so I have 2 chances at it. But now the way you said it like that, it makes so much sense why that's a stupid idea.
Well, and then you look at it in the long term, right? So like building your total and then having attempts with that weight on your back is, let's say you open at your 930 and then you jump to a 980 or something, 975. It's going to eat you alive because it's so fucking close to that 1,000. But then you get that weight on your back, and then the next time and then also if you do that, you're going to conserve a little bit of energy from straining against a crazy attempt for 2 lifts. And then you're going to do better in your bench and better in your deadlift and build the total overall. I think a lot of us forget that the sport is the total, but in multiply, most guys are like, fuck it, the sport's the squat.
Hell yeah.
But yeah, exactly, right? So if you get that, you get that 950 to 980 range going, and you've already hit it on a platform, then the next time, let's say you jump your opener up a little bit, and you're like, oh, I was already that close, that 1,000-pound jump takes on a whole different animal in your brain, and then it's way easier to wrap your mind around and then keep your composure and get into your techniques and have that conversation that you need to have with yourself when you're under those big weights. And the longer that you do this, the larger that conversation becomes. Instead of a 30-second, oh shit, I gotta squat this, we're going nuts,
Yeah.
PR time, it becomes, all right, I gotta pick this way, I gotta sit back, oh, it feels like shit, I gotta sail back, I gotta open harder. You have this big long conversation with yourself, and then you look at the video and it goes down, then boom, you blast it, and you're like, great lift, but then you're like, oh shit, I had like 10 minutes worth of shit going on in my head.
Yeah. Well, I think this is a good point to kind of wrap things up here. So I'll ask you as my final question. If you could give a new lifter or someone going into their first meet a word of advice, what would that be?
I would say take what is there and don't take what you want. That's the biggest thing is everybody gets those landmark weights. I want to squat 500 at this meet, whatever. I tell them, have a plan that have an A, B, and a C. All of those are very rough. Have experienced training partners that are your eye in the sky that know how you move certain weights. And then you guys have a powwow about it. Hey, it felt like this, but it looked like this. Let's meet in the middle, whatever, something like that, where if I hit a 700-pound raw squat and it feels like dog shit, and I look at the video, I smoked it on the video, my training partner's like, that's in the fucking pocket. I'm going to take a jump a little bit bigger than I thought I wanted to take just because they know how I move and they can kind of instill a little bit of confidence in you. And they're like, dude, you got it. And that saved my ass a bunch of times. So it's important to have that. But if you're, you know, like these kids now, they train by themselves and, you know, if they need to have a realistic goal. If you're in tune with your RPEs, go off the RPE for that day and understand that these totals are built over time. Like what I think most of these young kids do is they see some of these like flash pan, that fucking Maddox kid from whatever country, that deadlifts like 1,000 pounds. And they all want to be like this guy. So they want to shoot for that next, it's just 100-pound jumps. Like I hit 7 or they hit 600, like 700 next meet. I'm like, what fucking world are you living in? Where you think that you're just adding hundreds of pounds? I mean, I'm an asshole in that regard because I'm already thinking about a 1,200, but I'm not stupid enough just to load it up. I'm going to take my jumps through there and then take it when it's there, but I'm training for it preemptively, but I'm not going to implement that as a game plan strategy on the day of.
Yeah.
I would say that, and then force yourself to eat, and then force yourself to hydrate.
Yep.
And then build into your training wherever you think your fitness level is, or what we would call like a strength endurance level. Build more of that into your training because that's what gives you longevity throughout the meets. A lot of these guys train stuff like the way that we do it is genius, and I had already been training my guys like this for the deadlift. We're always pre-fatiguing our deadlift training with some squatting, and then the big main heavy days on the max effort end are like the squat. We do have our max effort deadlifts in there, but a lot of these guys, I see this all the time, they train their squat on one day and their deadlift separate, and then they base their meet attempts off of their PR squat or PR deadlift when they're going to deadlift, not understanding that 6 maximal effort attempts before that is going to take that opener of what would be like an RPE 8, 8.5, maybe a 9, whatever, and it's going to increase that to now you're almost at an RPE 10, and then you risk, I can't tell you how many kids I've almost seen bomb out in a raw fucking powerlifting meet from that. That would be that, and then the last one would be just don't pay attention to the bullshit. There's so many people that we lose in powerlifting simply because they just get sick of all of the weird shit that doesn't matter, and it's very, very weird. I've gotten caught up in it a billion times, and then I kind of snap out of them. I'm like, none of this is even real to me at all. Like, I have kids and shit. Like, I'm trying to teach my kid how to ride a fucking bike. Like, this dude and his hot take online is literally meaningless in my life. And then the less of that I pay attention to, the better off I do every time anyway.
Yeah, I think I agree with all the things you said. I think this was a great conversation. I want to thank you again for taking the time to come on, and I will see you this weekend.
No, hey, it was an honor. Thank you for having me on. I'm sorry it took us so long to fucking get this thing on the books. I think it was we started chatting about this like a year and a half ago or whatever it was.
Something like that. All right.
But yeah, I appreciate it, man.